Welcome to On What Slender Threads. This is Tradition 3. My name is Lynn. This presentation is based on a book that I wrote, On What Slender Threads, AA's 12 Traditions from a Historical Perspective. However, it is not necessary to buy the book unless you'd like to have it as a resource. It is my hope that these video presentations will highlight what I learned from studying the research on AA's early history from the literature available at the General Service Office of Alcoholics Anonymous and from the experiences and insights of AA friends around the world. I am not a spokesperson for AA. Any inferences in this study are strictly my own and in no way reflect the opinion of Alcoholics Anonymous. I hope it will be helpful. I like to start with a preamble that fits the tradition for each week. So for the third tradition, I chose a reminder from the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous. Outline the program of action explaining how you made a self-appraisal, how you straightened out your past, and why you are now endeavoring to be helpful to him. It is important for him to realize that your attempt to pass this on to him plays a vital part in your own recovery. Actually, he may be helping you more than you are helping him. Make it plain that he is under no obligation to you. That you hope only that he will try to help other alcoholics when he escapes his own difficulties. From Alcoholics Anonymous on page 94. Hopefully, you have already seen the presentations on Traditions 1 and 2. Now, no matter how we partition ourselves as groups, conference, committees, intergroups, regions, areas, unity means that there is only one group, Alcoholics Anonymous. Unity and our common welfare rely on how our partitions live and work together to carry the message. Decisions are made by the group through its group conscience, which is a spiritual expression of the group's higher power. Our leaders serve to carry out the wishes of the group. They are but trusted servants. Traditions 3 through 12 are the result of the anvils of experience that Bill spoke frequently about. They ensured that the trustees and the proposed conference could not alter those lessons that are essential to preserving AA's unity. Bill could only hope that the individual groups would follow. So let's take a look at Tradition 3. The only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking. In its original form, it says, our membership ought to include all who suffer from alcoholism. Hence, we may refuse none who wish to recover, nor ought AA membership ever depend upon money or conformity. Pay attention to that word, conformity. Any 2 or 3 alcoholics gathered together for sobriety may call themselves an AA group, provided that as a group they have no other affiliation. So notice that the original point simply says that our membership should include all who suffer from alcoholism. It's very different from requiring that members state that they have a desire to stop drinking. Tradition 3, let's take a look at some of the highlights from Bill's essay. Bill said, nobody can keep you out if you say so. You declare yourself. And why did they have so many rules? Because AA was so fragile in those early days, and they were meeting in homes, and Bill was poetic. He said we were like flickering candles in a windstorm. Time after time, our uncertain flames blew out and couldn't be relighted. Our constant thought was, which of us may be next? At that time, every group had membership rules. Everybody was scared witless, he said. We built a fine mesh around AA. He said we were grim because we felt our lives and our homes were threatened. So intolerance, you say? But here's the lesson he's trying to get across. Isn't fear the true basis of intolerance? Well, yes, we were intolerant. How could we guess that all those fears were to prove groundless? Could we then foresee that troublesome people were to become our principal teachers of patience and tolerance? And a very important line that I'll refer to again, he says, could any then imagine a society which would include every conceivable kind of character and cut across every barrier of race, creed, politics, and language with ease? That is why, he says, we leave it to each newcomer to decide himself whether he was an alcoholic and whether he should join us. Why did they do this? Why did we dare say, contrary to the experience of society and government everywhere, that we would neither punish nor deprive any AA of membership, that we must never compel anyone to pay anything, believe anything, or conform to anything? He says tradition 3 was simplicity itself. At last experience taught us that to take away any alcoholic's chance was to sometimes pronounce his death sentence and often to condemn him to endless misery. So then Bill brings up an example, two examples of people who did not conform to typical society of that day. And a gentleman walks in and speaks to having an addiction, even worse stigmatized than alcoholism. And he says the elders could only look at the objections. Shouldn't we sacrifice this one for the sake of many? But then one speaks up and says, what we are really afraid of is our reputation. He said, what would the master do? In Bill's second case, Bill handles the atheist, who definitely was a departure from the norm of his day. He tells the story of Ed as an atheist, how he browbeat everybody and into saying that this God nonsense should not even be discussed. And the elders were asking Ed to stop, but Ed would say, you can't talk like this. I mean, you can't throw me out. With great sarcasm, Ed would come back to them and say the only requirement for AA membership is a desire to stop drinking. And they would just groan and say, when would he stop? And finally, to their great relief, he drank. He drank. And in those days, when they went on a 12-step job, no matter what, they helped anybody who asked. But in this case, they chose not to help Ed. So finally, Ed had to steal into an AA member's house, and they then got the sense that maybe he was earnest. He thought before that they have deserted me. I've been deserted by my own kind. This is the end. Nothing is left. And then Bill adds that before he came in, he was tossing and turning on his bed, and his hand brushed the bureau nearby, touching a book. Opening the book, he read. It was a Gideon Bible. And he concludes, what would have happened to him and all others he later helped if we had succeeded throwing him out? Good grief. Well, I do have a few thoughts about this story. In Bill's essay on this tradition, he readily admits to the early fellowship's caution about who could come into their homes. That's a fair point, and we'll talk briefly about that in those early days. But keep in mind, only about 7 years had passed since the publication of the Big Book when Bill penned the 12 points to assure our future. When I look at his experiences that led to the writing of this tradition, it's clear that he was dealing with groups and continued to deal with groups that said, we don't want you here. Let's briefly track the progression of growth during AA's early beginnings up to when Bill wrote the points. Bill's data changes in the early printings of the first edition bore out how quickly that meet at someone's home notion gave way to larger venues. In the first edition, in Bill's story, he says, "There are 80 of us in our families. We meet frequently in our different homes, with 40 to 80 people in attendance." But a few years later, in the first edition, the second printing, he says, "There are 500 of us in our families, with 50 to 200 persons at their meetings." Notice that there is no mention of homes. By the third printing in June of 1942, I guess he just gave up because he stuck with 1,000 of us in our families. Bill must have been really excited with every update to the text, and while we're not going to get into Bill's statistics, I think this pattern is somewhat reasonable given the sales of the big book during that period. However, his own personal story provided a cautionary tale about opening one's home to alcoholics. The results were not always happy, and the same struggles were continuing in early meetings outside of homes. Bill said, "An alcoholic in his cups is an unlovely creature. Our struggles with them are variously strenuous, comic, and tragic. One poor chap committed suicide in my home." Oh, I can relate. I was in my cups on a train ride once, and I can assure you that I was definitely an unlovely creature. Nonetheless, impressed with the program's success with impossible cases, people did open their homes. The Akron squad owed much to T. Henry and Clarice Williams in Akron. They were already meeting an Oxford group every Wednesday night in their home. And it was at that Oxford group meeting that Dr. Bob confessed his troubles with alcohol, and Henrietta Seiberling said that she and others prayed and prayed and prayed, and Henrietta believed that their prayers came finally in the form of the Runhound from New York. Out of a genuine desire to help Bill and Dr. Bob, the Williams generously included the quickly growing fellowship that would eventually call itself the Akron Squad every Wednesday night. Around the time of the publication of the Big Book, things were starting to get tense between the alcoholics and the Oxford group. Clarence S. decided to take his Cleveland gang and start their own groups. By 1939, in December, simmering tensions, which we'll explore later, between the Oxford groupers and the remaining alcoholics, forced a spin-off. The Akron Squad finally separated from the Oxford group. Dr. Bob opened his home to the meetings, but it did not take long to realize they needed another venue. Dr. Bob wrote to Bill, "Had 74 Wednesday in my little house, but shall get a hall soon." Shortly after, the squad moved to the King School in Akron. The Williams generously kept their home open for meetings through 1954. So word of this impossible dream for struggling alcoholics was getting out. And you know what we struggling alcoholics are like. We love crashing parties. So let's talk about those earlier mentioned unlovely creatures. There were disruptions aplenty, to be sure. At least enough for groups to start experimenting with methods of sorting the serious from the not-so-serious participants. The Crawford group in Cleveland may have had one of the earliest beginners meetings in 1941 to serve that very purpose. In June 1943, the Northwest group of Detroit required prospects to attend 4 sessions of beginners meetings with the following themes: admission, spiritual, restitution and inventory, and working and message. Such were some of the earliest attempts to control who got into the meetings. Nowadays, there are back to basics meetings and beginners meetings that flourish without the heavy hand of rules for the most part. And if you're looking for someone to work with, they are the best meetings to attend to find newcomers. So flash forward slightly over 10 years after the 12 points were written. Bill painted a rosy picture of AA's open door policy in 1957 in Alcoholics Anonymous Comes of Age. He said, "Since that time, literally all kinds of people have found their way into Alcoholics Anonymous. Our inclusiveness is very broad indeed. Bill went on to describe the range of members from a countess to a hopefully former member of Al Capone's mob. He concluded, "That's how universal AA is today." Well, was AA truly universal and welcoming? We'll take a closer look at the two stories in Bill's essay, along with some other cases. So when we read Bill's essay, we'll see that he first addresses AA's early fears, reasonable, and its membership rules, which were not so reasonable. The thing about rules is that one rule begets another rule. Rules seem to proliferate like kudzu in Mississippi, and then the job of enforcement has to fall on someone. And so this became a tradition that has a keep it simple principle. It seems that portion of Bill's essay should be sufficient for Tradition 3. But then he decided to continue with two stories that are preemptive strikes at rules that exclude alcoholics who didn't fit a particular profile. One is about people who are different from the norm. The other is about people who are unconventional in their beliefs. Oddly, his answer to the first is an all-encompassing acceptance of people who are different, while the second story implied conformity to beliefs of the norm. Remember from our reading, Bill implied Ed the atheist had a religious awakening when he talked about how he tossed on his bed, his hand brushed a book, and opening it, it was a Gideon Bible. The implication being Ed was transformed from that moment. Ed, in the story, was actually Jim Burwell. In the big books, The Vicious Cycle. The story in the essay very closely follows Jim's story in the big book, except for the end. Jim had a different view of what happened after he returned to the fellowship. He wrote in The Vicious Cycle, "For a long time, the only higher power I could concede was the power of the group, but this was far more than I had ever recognized before, and it was at least a beginning. It was also an ending, for never since June 16, 1938, have I had to walk alone." And the real story gets better when Jim talks about having to move to Philadelphia after he had gotten sober the second time. He said, "I found myself in the middle of a brand new group. When I started to tell the boys about how we did it in New York and all about the spiritual part of the program, I found they would not believe me unless I was practicing what I preached." What better example is there for the AA adage, "Your actions speak so loud, I can't hear what you're saying"? Jim then went on to share the benefits of acting as if. He said, "Then I found that as I gave in to this spiritual or personality change, I was getting a little more serenity. In telling newcomers how to change their lives and attitudes, all of a sudden I found I was doing a little changing myself." Well, we talked in Tradition 2 about Bill's fixation that the program could only result in believing in a God of Bill's understanding. And unfortunately, his tunnel vision in this area resulted in missing a perfect opportunity to widen the spiritual path in the essay on this tradition. There is no better description of the spiritual experience of the educational variety than Jim's story in the big book. The truth is better than the myth. Well, when we get to Tradition 10, we'll look more closely at AA and religion as an outside issue. But let's go on to another test case for the nascent fellowship, that unpredictable or very predictable mixture of men and women in the early fellowship. While society did not appreciate alcoholic men, alcoholic women were considered the lowest of the low. In late 1935, one of the first women to seek help was Lil in Akron. Lil promptly caused a disruption that was a distressing combination of alcohol, sex with another member, and the ensuing destruction of Dr. Bob's office to seek out and gobble down pills. Now, according to an Akron member's wife, Lil eventually got sober without AA, but her impact on the fellowship remained. Not a stellar start for women in Akron. And remember, as Bill wrote in his essay, this was the era of rules in AA. If we have a problem, we'll make a rule. So what's the rule that would work for the Lil problem? Well, why don't we put alcoholic in with the alcoholic men's wives? Well, if you think about that for a few minutes, you know it's not going to work, and certainly it did not work. So let's come up with another rule. Women who are so bad could not be admitted at all. That'll teach them. And unfortunately, the early AA meetings landscape is littered with rules that had the effect of propelling alcoholic women to their deaths. Of course, most meetings in AA's early beginnings were in homes, and the presence of alcoholics' wives were in close proximity to the meeting made the entry of alcoholic women all the more difficult. But as Shaberg rightfully pointed out, if alcoholic wives posed barriers, the men could be just as bad and often acted in ways that did nothing to alleviate their wives' fears. Case in point, another headache for Dr. Bob came in the form of Sylvia Kay. Sylvia's story is the keys of the kingdom. The men in Akron were perhaps too enthusiastic about helping this young, rich divorcee. Their enthusiasm rubbed off on Sylvia to the extent that she thought it might be a good idea to move from Chicago to Akron. Someone suggested Sylvia could do more good by starting a group in Chicago. According to Shaberg, Sylvia was summarily escorted to the train station by several members, and she left for the Windy City, much to the relief of Dr. Bob and all of the AA wives in Ohio. Sadly, Sylvia relapsed on the way back to Chicago. The solution proposed for the Sylvia problem could have resulted in her alcoholic death. Fortunately, she knew Earl T., who had been traveling back and forth to Akron. Together, she got sober, and they became the most active founding members of AA in Chicago. In those early days, Dr. Bob was particularly perturbed about women, given that they posed what he referred to as the sex problem. It was actually Dr. Bob's wife, Anne, who brought him around to accepting women in meetings. According to LGT, Dr. Bob relented. He said, "Why not? What difference does it make? They're just as drunk as the men are." Now, apparently the New York Fellowship was more receptive to helping women. Florence R., who wrote A Feminine Victory, was the only alcoholic woman's story included in the first edition of the Big Book. Wistfully, she wrote, "To my lot falls the rather doubtful distinction of being the only lady alcoholic in our particular section." Florence helped many, many women in AA, but sadly she relapsed, and eventually she died in 1943. So those were two of the cases that strained the fellowship before the book was written. Was that what Bill was thinking when he wrote in A Vision for You? No one is too discredited or has sunk too low to be welcomed cordially, if he means business. Social distinctions, petty rivalries, and jealousies, these are laughed out of countenance. Being wrecked on the same vessel, being restored and united under one God, with hearts and minds attuned to the welfare of others, the things which matter so much to some people no longer signify much to them. How could they? Well, how could they indeed? Unfortunately, they could, and they did. Efforts by members to block people who were out of step would continue after the flying blind period, well into the period of AA's great test for unity. Let's look at Bill's frustration with race in the third tradition. Bill had gone to a sanitarium and spoke about AA. There were two black alcoholics very interested in what he had to share, so he invited them to come back to a New York area meeting when they got out. Well, this resulted in a divisive firestorm amongst the group members. Obviously, it never occurred to Bill that he should have asked the group first for permission. How could he know it would be a problem? Watching the group's reaction was his first indicator that he'd made a mistake. So Bill asked the group, would those who protested, including the two men in the meeting, at least agree that they had a right to AA just the same as everyone else? Of course, the objectors had to agree in principle. With that wedge, Bill managed to get the group to concede that Negroes should be invited to attend open or closed meetings as visitors. That is, as visitors, blacks could come to the meetings as silent observers. In this and many other instances, AA fell far short of Bill's vision in A Vision for You, the claim that social distinctions are laughed out of countenance. Fortunately, some members helped blacks get their own group started, so that as early as 1945, St. Louis and Chicago started the earliest black groups, followed closely by Washington, D.C.'s black group founded by Jim S., whose story is Jim's story and is in the second, third, and fourth editions of the Big Book. Such experiences, of course, are couched in the framework of society in the 30s and 40s. That is, what happened in AA was very much a mirror of the cultural norms of the United States. Now, acknowledging the status quo for that era is important, but it also underscores the question, now that it is over 80 years later, is this who we want to be today? Even back then, our co-founder Bill was far from satisfied with this passive exclusion policy, as was indicated in his 1943 letter. He wrote, "Along with you, I feel very deeply about this race business. All men should have an equal opportunity to recover from alcoholism. That's the shining ideal. But unhappily, my own experience suggests that it may not be achieved in our lifetime." Bill was referring to the obstructive action in his own New York group. Bill said he had already been slapped down, and he realized pressuring the group to do otherwise would only cause harm. Bill continued sadly, "It falls grievously short of our ideal. But practically speaking, what can be done about it? I don't know. I'm still looking hard for the answer." Of course, his best hope was in the third tradition, but he clearly did not broach that topic in his essay. However, Bill did seize every opportunity he could to avoid the silent observer option. In 1945, Barry L. called Bill when a black individual with a multitude of other differences, bleached hair, ex-convict, homeless, wearing makeup, and dope fiend, showed up at the clubhouse. Then, as the story is told in Pass It On, "Now," said Bill, "did you say it was a drunk?" "Oh, yes," Barry replied. "There's no question about that. He is certainly a drunk." "Well, I think that's all we can ask," said Bill. The group welcomed the man, and even though they never saw him again, Barry said this moment in AA created a precedent for the third tradition. It's a little bit funny that Barry L. is the teller of this tale. Bill may have created a precedent, but it was not necessarily one that would stick, as Barry would learn later. Remember the part about the essay about the newcomer with the affliction, even more stigmatized than alcoholism? This was the person who confessed he was a sexual deviant. The classic solution in Bill's third tradition essay was offered by Dr. Bob. What would the master do? Well, that sounds like another precedent, doesn't it? Well, Bill went on to say in the essay, could then any imagine a society which would include every conceivable kind of character and cut across every barrier of race, creed, politics, and language with ease? In fact, it would be very difficult to imagine AA as such a society if one had witnessed the delegates in the conference 20 years after this had been written. In 1973 and 1974, our own conference delegates struggled with the idea of listing gay meetings in the GSO World Directory. There was so much argument against listing gay meetings, they had to table the matter in 1973. And it wasn't resolved in 1974 until a member of the conference pointed out that they had approved young people's and women's special groups. Why were they picking on these people? Special groups, which we'll talk more about in our next presentation, had already been listed. I have to ask, did our delegates miss this tradition? So drive home a point, Bill wrote about the worthy alcoholic. He said, all people who have a desire to stop drinking are worthy, including chronic relapsers, young people, people who drank only a little, homeless, and people with other issues. I mean, I was invited by a judge to visit the folks in AA. They referred to people like me as slip signers. One day, someone burst out, why are these slip signers here? We don't want slip signers. And of course, I thought, I don't want to be here either. But thank goodness for the kind voices that told me to keep coming back. It falls on the members of AA to practice acceptance. Acceptance not to judge anyone else's desire to stop drinking. And I'll go you one better than that. Not just acceptance, appreciation for all who enter. That's advanced sobriety. In the AA tradition, How It Developed pamphlet, Bill reminds us that our AA door stands wide open, and if he passes through it and commences to do anything about his problem, he is considered a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. He signs nothing, agrees to nothing, promises nothing. He joins us on his own say-so. Bill noted that some AA groups take this tradition a step further. He said nowadays in most groups he doesn't even have to admit he's an alcoholic. He can join AA on the mere suspicion that he may be one, that he may already show the fatal symptoms of our malady. Now, this does not mean that prospects or members can disrupt the meeting while being unlovely creatures. Bill goes on to say, if a member persists in coming to meetings drunk, he may be let outside. We may ask someone to take him away. But in most groups, he can come back the next day if sober. However, Bill's most important point of all invokes the we part of AA's tradition, common welfare and unity. He says, we do not wish to deny anyone his chance to recover from alcoholism. So how do you become a group member? In the AA group pamphlet, it says group membership requires no formal application, just as we are members of AA. If we say we are, so are we members of a group if we say we are. On a personal note, I realize that Tradition 3 has to begin with me. Love, acceptance, and tolerance for all who enter. And I will always remember Fred. Years ago, Fred walked into my group one evening and scared the daylights out of me. He was filthy, ragged, and clearly mentally disturbed. He straggled in and angrily scoped the room, and I'm looking for a way out. Almost immediately, however, two of our old-timers ran up to Fred and greeted him and treated him like he was royalty. They excitedly talked to him and gave him a cup of coffee and, well, because of those two beautiful old-timers, poor Fred didn't stand a chance. He got sober even with his mental challenges. Over time, his appearance improved and his demeanor became more relaxed. I gave him a ride home after a meeting one night and was struck by how grateful he was for his sobriety. Fred died a year after that, still sober. His family loved AA. And I am so grateful for the old-timers who showed me the true spirit of this tradition, unconditional love and acceptance of all who enter. Coming up, we have Tradition 4. When we study the fourth tradition, we will learn that Bill was dismayed when he discovered that some groups used autonomy of the group as an excuse to keep struggling alcoholics out. We will find out that it was quite the opposite. The fourth tradition was intended to reach as many alcoholics as possible. Comments and questions. If you want to be on a mailing list for upcoming workshops, please email me at whatslenderthreads@gmail.com. For other resources and workshop flyers, see www.onwhatslenderthreads.com. And thank you so much.